Hi everyone, hope you're having a lovely day. This is Miss Mokwa bringing you another one of our audio lectures. This is going to be the first lecture in our new series for the learning section. So this is going to be our first chapter in the learning unit. We've progressed past the cognitive unit, and this is going to be study number 1 in learning, Bandura. As usual, if you want to take out your notes, anything to jot down, anything you want to add to your PowerPoint, make sure you have that in front of you now. Also, I will warn you that Bandura is quite a long study. It is significantly longer than a lot of the other studies that we've covered. So if you want to grab a cup of coffee or tea, a blanket, something to make you more comfortable, kind of strap in because Bandura is going to be a long one. It's becoming a little bit more complex in this second unit versus the first cognitive unit. You'll notice as well that if you go to the end of your PowerPoint questions or look at the end of this presentation, you do not have PowerPoint questions for this unit. So you will not have homework for this. You will not have PowerPoint questions that are due the day of your quiz as they're usually due. In this case, you're going to have multiple choice questions on your quizzes. So we'll review those concepts that are going to be on the quiz at the very end of the PowerPoint. I'll explain that a little bit more, but it's very straightforward. Just telling you what to study for your quiz at the end of the presentation for Bandura. So with that, guys, we're going to get started. So we may not realize on a conscious level how much of what we do is actually learned behavior. Things like reading a book, eating a meal, driving, if you're learning to drive at this age, riding a bike, even writing. Learning is such a core part of who we are as people from a very, very young age. In this chapter, we're going to be learning more about how animals learn. How humans learn. So it's going to be human children as our main subjects. After this study, we'll go more into how animals learn with Pepperberg. But in this case, we're going to start our study thinking about how learning affects us over the lifespan, kind of when we're younger especially. So as I said, the vast majority of our learning happens when we're young, when we're small. Of course, when you're young, every experience is a new experience. So the first time you go to school or ride the bus, anything that happens to you is new and novel. So that's when a lot of our learning is going to take place in our lifespan. Now, one problem we tend to run into when we think about learning is that people assume that learning is just this concept of memorization. Memorizing things, for example, if you're in math class and you have to memorize a bunch of different formulas for a quiz, people think that that's traditionally learning. We're not going to think of it that way. It's not just memorization. So in this context for psychology, learning is more about things like punishment and reward and your own life experiences. If you look down there for Kimball, we have a definition of learning from 1961, a relatively permanent change in behavioral potential which accompanies experience. So this would essentially mean that based on your life experiences, what you've gone through, that is going to dictate how you behave. So this version of learning, this definition of learning really relies upon your life experiences and how that changes you as a person, teaching you, for example, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So that's a really great point to start at. I would memorize this for your quiz, by the way, just a hint. Make sure you understand Kimball. Moving on to slide 3, we've expanded upon Kimball a little bit. So if you look at the definition for Kimball here, for learning, you'll see after the arrow, we've added an interesting little point that I really want to emphasize. So we have a change in behavior caused by experience or exposure to specific stimuli. So I would mark that in some way, star that in some way. We learn not only through what we do, but how we watch other people do things. So by observation, we have 2 kinds of learning we're going to talk about. We have the kind of learning where I go through something and I've learned from my experience. So that's more like direct learning. As I've said, direct learning is something that I go through myself personally, and I understand how that is going to change and affect me because I was the one who experienced it. We also have observational or indirect learning. So this is going to be, I watch something happen, I process that information, and now even though it didn't happen to me, I've observed it, and because I've observed it, it is going to change how I behave. So for example, let's put it in kind of 3 hypothetical example contexts. Okay, so let's start with our first one. That's going to be the video game example. This is going to be an example of indirect learning that is positive. So let's say you are watching your friend play a video game. Let's say you're watching Zelda. So they're playing Legend of Zelda and you're watching them. Now, even though you aren't playing the video game yourself, you might be learning how to beat that level just by watching someone else play and the mistakes they make. So if they're playing Mario and they're in the dungeon and you see them get beaten by the boss, maybe when it's your turn to play, you'll know how to beat the boss in the game because you saw them and how they failed. So by watching the other person who's playing the video game, you may learn what to avoid, what things not to do, so that you can beat the level. So that would be an example of observational learning for the first one. Our second example is a pretty funny one. It's going to be an example of negative observational learning. So for example, let's say you have a sibling, and let's say that they are your older sibling, so they're older than you. And let's say they break a rule. So let's say that they stay out past curfew. So mom and dad want you home by 11 o'clock and your older sibling doesn't come home until after curfew. Now, if they receive a punishment of some sort, like their phone gets taken away or they get grounded, even though that didn't happen to you, you watched that person, that sibling, make a choice and see the consequences of that choice. So you're learning, for example, and seeing it observationally, and learning that, oh, if I do that, if I stay out too late, mom and dad are going to ground me or take my phone away. So in this way, you're learning even though the negative action didn't happen to you. So that's going to be an example of negative observational learning. And then last, let's say we have an example of positive experience-based learning. So this is not based on observation. This is based on experience, something that you yourself actually do. Let's say that you're visiting your grandparents for the weekend and they ask you to help them with some things around the house. So they give you a list of chores, some housework they could really appreciate your help with. Things like doing the dishes, taking out the garbage, maybe helping wash the car, things like that. So let's say you choose to help your grandparents, you follow exactly what they say, you do every single chore or housework kind of item on the list, and afterward they say thank you so much, let's make a nice delicious dinner. They give you a hug and they say, I really appreciate what you did for me. Now that's an example of positive experience-based learning because you learned in that case, oh, if I do what my grandparents ask me, if I help them, if I carry through these tasks I was asked to do, I'm going to get positive reinforcement and I'm going to receive something positive, a hug, some kind of warmth, an emotional reaction that's positive, and a nice dinner. So that's an example of positive experience-based learning. So looking at Bandura specifically, as I've said, learning is not always active and it's not always positive. So once again, I've got some funny examples for you. The first one is about bad habits, things like procrastination. I myself used to be a notorious procrastinator. I would leave everything till the last minute. If I had a project due, on Tuesday, I'd start that project Monday afternoon or Monday night. And that's not a good habit. That's not a good thing that you should learn. But you still learned it. Now, why is that? You may have had a trend in your life where you started to do your projects later and later, but you still had a somewhat positive result. So maybe you got away with getting a B or a higher grade on the project or the assignment, even though you didn't pace yourself maybe the way you should have. So you can have bad habits and negative kind of things that you learn. Learning is not always a good thing. It's not universally positive. So procrastination is an example of that. That would be a negative experience-based example of learning. Another funny one is things like curse words. So if you've ever been a babysitter or you've babysat someone, if you babysit a very young child who's just in that language acquisition, that learning phase of learning how to talk, that child will sometimes repeat words that you say, and you might regret it if you're babysitting or something, if you're having a conversation and you use a word you shouldn't use. So if you use a curse word, maybe you're on the phone talking to a friend or you're talking to someone else and the baby hears the word, they could repeat that word. So that would be an example of negative observational learning. That's negative observational learning because the baby got the word from their environment. They got the word from observing you, hearing you use the word in conversation. And then the last one is going to be an example of neutral learning that is observational. This is neither good nor bad. So food preferences, you have that happen usually based on a lot of factors, but one of the major ones is culture. So, for example, being Sicilian American, Italian American, there are certain foods that I grew up with that other people may not have. For example, that may also be true if you are Middle Eastern, if you're Greek, if you're Irish, whatever you might be, wherever you might come from, your food culture would really impact what you ate at the dinner table every night. So your food preferences are kind of learned through your environment based on what your mother or father cooks that night. And the trends you see, what they cook over and over. Most people have a little kind of list of recipes they kind of follow. So food preferences are another example of learning, things that you learn indirectly that you don't even kind of realize that you're taking in. Moving on to slide 5. Bandura is going to be studying what we call imitative learning. So learning that happens when you have young children watch a role model. And then you want to see if the children imitate the behavior of the role model later on when the model has left the room. The model is no longer present. So for example, if a young boy watches an older male become aggressive with a plastic clown doll, which is what's going to happen here. Once the adult role model leaves, will the young child become aggressive with that doll? That's the idea here with Bandura. Will learning be imitated? Do children learn from same-sex and opposite-sex role models? How does this apply to their behavior when it comes to things like aggression or violence? So that's where we're going to be kind of moving toward here. You can also call imitative learning social learning. These two are synonyms. So you could say, for example, on a quiz, if I was asking you about something, you could say imitative learning, or you could also say social learning. Now, specific to Bandura, what he thought is that if these children watched a certain type of behavior, they would later on imitate that same behavior when the model was no longer present or in the same room. This applies to positive behavior of the role model and negative behavior of the role model. So think of it this way. If the role model was non-aggressive to the Bobo doll, the child would then later be non-aggressive to the Bobo doll. If the role model was aggressive to the Bobo doll, the child later on would be aggressive to the Bobo doll. So just the idea that the child's behavior is going to match the role model's behavior later on when the children are tested alone. When there's no role model present, the child is still going to behave like the role model because the role model has made a major imprint on the child, and the child has learned from the adult role model's behavior, even if the adult role model is no longer in the room. So referencing both points below, this kind of explains those two concepts. This works both ways. It means the child will model the model. Will model the model if the model is aggressive or if the model is non-aggressive. So this works in a negative way, imitating negative behaviors, and in a positive way, imitating positive, non-aggressive behaviors. Moving on to some more background. Let's take this into a bit of a broader context. I believe we watched the documentary in class about this, Misrepresentation. So if you want to mentally kind of take yourself back to that documentary, talking about socialization and gender roles, we're going to kind of go back to that. If you have any notes you'd like to pull out at this time, based on the documentary, based on in-class discussions we've had about gender roles and rigid gender society-based eras, you can do that now. I'm going to give you a second to pull out any notes you may have. Okay, so moving on. If we think about this time period, this era in society, in American society, late 1950s, early 1960s, we have to remember that, in America at least, we tend to reward children in this time for behaving in correct, gender-specific, or sex-appropriate ways. So when I say a sex-appropriate behavior, we're talking about a time where male and female children were treated very differently. Of course, the idea, girls wear pink, boys wear blue, boys play sports, girls play dolls or play makeup or dress up. These gender norms and roles are very strictly enforced in the late 50s, early 60s. So because of that, children are going to be rewarded by their parents for exhibiting sex-appropriate behaviors. Maybe a little girl playing with mommy's makeup or putting on her mom's heels, or a little boy who picks up a catcher's mitt and wants to go outside and play catch with his dad, or plays cops and robbers with a little plastic gun with one of his friends. So children on a social level, past the individual level, are going to be rewarded for behaving in a quote-unquote sex-appropriate way. That is going to drive who the children respond more to. So little girls are going to look up to older females as the role model, and little boys are going to be more influenced and look up to older men as their role model. Remember, based on both nature and nurture, so nature being things like testosterone and chromosomal makeup, XY, versus nurture, which is this whole element of how we're socialized, boys tend to be stereotyped and tend to be, in general, more aggressive than girls. So boys tend to have more issues with physical aggression, and girls tend to have more issues with verbal aggression. So saying things that are unkind versus becoming physically involved with someone when they have a disagreement. So if we take this, beyond the individual level, that's going to give us a lot of insight about why these children behave the way they do, and also who they look up to as a model and why. Now, we also talked about in the documentary you guys watched, the power of advertising, the power of this socialization on young children, because it's what they see from their parents, but also from the media. So let's take a look now at some advertisements that, these are all real, by the way. I didn't Photoshop these in any way, I promise you. Some of them are a bit shocking and maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but these are real advertisements from the 1950s and 60s that aired or were present in national magazines. So let's take a look at these. And you'll see the running theme here is the idea that females are supposed to be functional and domestic, that they are meant to take care of the home and the children, be aesthetically pleasing, always be of a certain look and weight, are valued based on their appearance and must always look feminine and well put together. Men are meant to be masculine, they're meant to bring home financial resources, they are meant to be powerful and domineering over women, that they occupy a higher level of power in the society. So we see a lot of these gender stereotypes reflected in this kind of advertising, and this is going to kind of trickle down and affect young girls and affect women in the society and how they perceive themselves, and also what that means when it comes into gender roles and how they're supposed to behave. Moving into some more background. Based on these very specific ways we socialize boys and girls, the stereotypes they grow up with, and the ways we try to reinforce certain behaviors, Bandura had the thought that two differences were going to occur in boys and girls in this Bobo doll experiment. So the first thing he thought would happen is that boys and girls are going to follow the same-sex model. So when I say same-sex model, as I referenced earlier, young girls will look up to and act like older women, and young boys will look up and behave like older men. So the same-sex model just means that boys will behave like men, the male model in the room, and girls will behave like women, the female model in the room. So it's not so much a crossover, like young boys will behave like an older female. We don't really see that. And it's the same way for girls. We don't see girls behave as much like older men because we haven't been socialized or brought up to think like, oh, that's how I'm supposed to behave. So the young female is going to behave like the older female because she thinks to herself, oh, she's an older version of me. We're in the same category or group, and therefore this is how I'm supposed to act because this is how she's acting. So this relates directly to Bandura's first possible speculation. Now the second one he thought, which we've also found to be true, is that, as I've said earlier, boys become more physically aggressive. They're more likely to imitate physical aggressive behavior and aggression in general, because this is reinforced by the culture. The idea of machismo, the idea of being masculine, means being tough and being strong and being able to beat up your enemies or opponents. So because of masculine gender norms, boys will be more aggressive in general and more physically aggressive. This is how we're going to relate to Bandura's second possible speculated aim or idea. I would say idea because aims are about to come up next. Okay, so going on to our aim, as you know, every single study is going to have one of these. And for Bandura, it is a bit of a mouthful to investigate whether a child would learn aggression by observing a model and would replicate this behavior in the absence of the model. I would actually segment it there and just highlight and mark that part. And then there's kind of a part 2 that I want you to add on, but I'd like for you to think of this as 2 separate ideas because of the way the study is laid out. So make sure you understand this entire aim, but I would kind of mentally segment it into 2 pieces or parts. So that's part 1. And then part 2 would be, and would reproduce this behavior in the absence of the model. So once again, as I said, if the model is no longer in the room, will the child still act the way the model acted when they're alone and they can do whatever they would like to do? Now, as much as possible, try to take this aim and reproduce it in the same kind of language that I have. Don't cut corners, don't make it too short. But you'll see on the next slide, we have 4 hypotheses of Bandura, and those have been summarized for you. So in this case with the aim, try to keep it as close as possible to what I've written. But with the 4 hypotheses, if you need to shorten things up a little bit, that's okay. Now, moving on to these 4 hypotheses, give the first 2 a look over, but I caution you to be very careful because the first 2 are general ideas. We are not talking about biological sex or gender here. This is more about aggression or non-aggression. So we'll get to the sex-gender part in a little bit, but just for now, focus on hypotheses 1 and 2. So hypothesis number 1, observed aggressive behavior will be imitated. So this just means that if an adult model is aggressive, there is a higher likelihood of that child being aggressive. And hypothesis number 2 is the opposite. If the model behaves non-aggressively, we have a high chance the children will behave non-aggressively. So once again, this does not relate to sex or gender. That is going to come in hypothesis number 3. Take a moment and look these over. All right, moving on to hypotheses 3 and 4. If you want to star hypothesis 3 and 4, that'd be great. So hypothesis number 3, children are more likely to copy the same-sex model. As I said, this is where gender and sex come in. So a boy is more likely to imitate an older male. A girl is more likely to imitate an older female. This relates to gender norms and expectations. And then if you move to number 4, boys are more likely to copy aggression than girls. This applies to all types of aggression, whether that be physical or verbal, because as we've said, it is more socially acceptable. It is a sex-typed behavior for a boy to behave that way because it has been defined in our culture as masculine. So make sure we star number 3 and number 4. All 4 of these hypotheses are incredibly important, but 3 and 4 are a little bit tricky, so I'd like for us to mark those, please. Moving on to methodology, we are currently on slide 14. Bandura is a lab experiment. It is very, very different than some of the other studies we've covered because technically, even though it's a lab experiment, I would mark next to this or write down, it's structured like a lab experiment, but it's done in an environment that children are used to being in. It's done in a daycare center. So it's a lab experiment, but it's being done in a very unique setting. Please mark that down and be aware. Now, it's independent measures design. There are 3 IVs, so this gets a little bit complicated, but I'll make sure to break it all down for you. It's important to understand that all the children are only tested one time in their own group. But we do match children for aggression using a match participants design. So I will be explaining that as well. When we go to the graphics part, you'll see some pictures, and I'll be explaining that to you. So what we did in the study to make sure that when we broke up our groups, they were equal for the amount of aggression in each group is that we matched the children for aggression. I'll be explaining what that means a little bit later on. And we have this in a controlled environment. So as we were talking about earlier, the children are observed throughout the entire experiment. It's going to be through the special mirror that we've talked about previously, and it's going to be without their knowledge. So all of their behaviors are going to be recorded in a very specific manner, but the thing here that's very ethically gray is that the children are going to be watched by the experimenters and they don't know they're being watched. It's a covert observation. So you'll see that ethically Bandura is a not very strong study. There are many things he did wrong, and this study has been kind of replicated in the present, or after its original inception, but it's very hard to replicate because there were a lot of ethical boundaries that were crossed. So we'll make sure to talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so in the Bobo doll experiment, here's where things get a little tricky, so make sure you stay with me. There are 3 IVs, so 3 things that are going to be changed or manipulated based on the condition or based on how things are going to be tested. So the first IV is model type. So whether the child is going to see an aggressive model, a non-aggressive model, or not see a model at all. Of course, if they're not going to see a model, if there's no change, those children are going to be part of the control group. So I would highlight or mark that next to number 1, please. Next, you have your second IV, model, sex, gender. So if the model is the same sex as the child, so a young boy watching an adult male or a young girl watching an adult female, or if it's opposite, so if a young boy is watching an older female or if a young girl is watching an older male. And then last is, of course, the sex or gender of the child. So the child watching all this happen, is the child male or female? Now moving on to the DV. The DV, of course, is going to be the learning the child displayed. So if the child does or does not imitate the model after being exposed to the model's behavior. Now, as I said earlier, this is a controlled, covert observation. We're going to use the magic of the one-way mirror. We talked about this in the context of police interrogation, for example. So the researchers can see the children, but the children cannot see the researchers. So the researchers are going to observe the children and record their behavior at standardized intervals. So standardized intervals would mean, for example, every 2 minutes, every 3 minutes, every 30 seconds, just using a standardized amount of time passing. Now, one other important thing to remember here, children being at a certain cognitive level, the one-way mirror works great for them because they don't know they're being observed. Most of them can't kind of put 2 and 2 together and think, hey, why is there a giant mirror in the wall right there? Adults, however, usually know they're being observed, so this one-way mirror technique, though fantastic for children, does not work very well with adults. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about our sample. It's going to break down in a little bit in a complex fashion. So for now, I'm going to give you the broad strokes, and then when we get to the graphic that's going to show you the breakdown visually, then I think it's really going to click for you. It's going to make sense. So we have 72 participants total, evenly split for gender. So 36 boys and 36 girls, ages 3 to 6, from the Stanford University Nursery School, which is going to be very similar to kind of a daycare center with some academic elements. So it's going to be a nursery school for very young children. And interestingly enough, it's actually on the Stanford campus, so it's meant for Stanford students who have children so that the parents can go to school and take their classes and then pick up their kids when they're finished. So I thought that was a very interesting little tidbit. Now, thinking about this sample, we should consider that it's evenly split for gender as a strength, and we have a good sample size. So we should keep those 2 things in mind. Okay, so we have a total, as I said, of 72 children in the experiment. So before we actually sort the children, the teacher and one experimenter used scales to figure out how aggressive each child was. So let's say we did this on a scale of 1 to 5. Okay? We needed to do this to make sure that each group was matched for aggression. So if we were going to do a study based on imitative learning, and it needed to be about aggression, imitating aggression from an adult model, we need to understand and be aware that we don't make a mistake, that we, for example, don't accidentally place all the aggressive kids in one group and all of the super zen mellow kids in another group. So if we do that, that is going to interfere with the validity of our experiment and the validity of our results. So this is what we mean when we say matched for regression. So let's say we have a group of 6 children. Okay, let's say we have a group of 6 children. We want to make sure that we have children in that group who are a 1 on aggression, meaning super mellow and calm, and a 5 for aggression, meaning very, very aggressive. We need a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5. Or we need as much as possible to have a balanced little mini sample. We need to make sure, as I've said, that not all the aggressive children are in one place and all the mellow children are in another. They have to be adequately mixed up. So that's what we mean when we say matched for aggression on that top part of the first paragraph. As the experiment goes on, it's important to note that children are always being watched by 2 experimenters, not 1. So this is going to really help with inter-rater reliability, making sure that the measure they're using to observe the children and quantify results is valid, and making sure that both raters are seeing the same things and recording them numerically the same way. So having 2 raters here is an excellent strength and very, very important. So as you see in the underline, the results of the 2 raters show high inter-rater reliability, a correlation of 0.89, which is incredibly strong. Remember, the closer we get to 1.0 would be perfect. So a high inter-rater reliability of 0.89 is absolutely fantastic. It shows the It shows the validity of that measure, of the scale or whatever the observers are using to rate the children, and the fact that they're seeing the same things. So this is very, very good. Okay, so we've made it to the graphics slide. Now, let me explain this one pretty thoroughly. I want you, if you could, to go to the top of the slide with the blue box and draw an arrow downward toward the little orange boxes. This is how the sample is going to be split from largest to smallest. So starting at the top, making a big arrow facing downward to the bottom of the slide, that's going to be the flow of how the children are separated. Now, as you can see from the top box, we start with 72 children in total. Then they're going to get split 3 ways. So 24 children will see an aggressive role model, 24 will see a non-aggressive role model, and then 24 on the far right there are going to be in the control group. So I would circle the control group. They have no model. They're not going to see an adult. Remember, the control group is just a baseline where nothing really happens to them. So I would circle that group, please. Then if you go back to the left, you'll see the 24 aggressive role model broken down to female model and male model. So this just means that half of the 24 children are going to see a female model who is aggressive, and half of the 24 children are going to see a male model that's aggressive. So we're going to break that down one more time, and you'll see that it's 6 boys and 6 girls. So if you go down to the orange boxes, that's showing on the far left that 6 boys will see an aggressive female model, 6 girls will see an aggressive female model, and then moving over a little bit, 6 boys will see an aggressive male model, and 6 girls will see an aggressive male model. If you move to the middle, it's going to be the exact same thing, but now we're at non-aggressive role model. So 6 boys will see a non-aggressive female model, and 6 girls will see a non-aggressive female model, and 6 boys will see a non-aggressive male model, and 6 girls will see a non-aggressive male model. So that is breaking down this slide, explaining exactly who is going to see what. And if you circle on the bottom there, those 6 groups, 6 boys, 6 girls that you have, all of those orange boxes, those are the groups that were matched for aggression. So those groups of 6 boys and 6 girls, we had to make sure that it wasn't a bunch of aggressive people or a bunch of very zen, calm people for those children. So those groups were matched for aggression. Now moving on to procedure, this is going to be an in-depth breakdown outline for you, explaining what happened in the study. Now, I'm going to let you guys look this over for a minute, and then I'm going to break down step number 2. Okay, so let's highlight or mark step number 2. All children were made to be, they were deliberately made to be mildly upset or annoyed. Now, that is ethically questionable at best. We're annoying or upsetting these children on purpose. Why would we ever do that? The idea here is that we need to upset the children in the beginning to make their reactions more instant. So children tend to react very quickly when they've been upset or hurt or something. So if we didn't kind of antagonize the children and make them a little bit frustrated, a little bit upset, making them more reactive, we may not have been able to get results. So once again, I understand that ethically this is very gray and very questionable, that they're upsetting children on purpose, but this is going to be the thing that allows us to get results in a very short time frame about aggression, because you triggered the children to have a reaction to begin with. So that is why this kind of step 2 is absolutely crucial. You'll see that the way they did this was to let the children play in a room, and then they took the toys away and said, oh, I'm sorry, these are the good toys for the other children. So they took the toys the children were playing with away, and then they moved them to another room. So of course, that would upset any small child from the age of 3 to 6. So that second room they go into is where they're going to be observed with the one-way mirror. So we've kind of segued into that perfectly. We've upset the children, and now they're ready to be observed. Moving on to some more procedure now. Take a moment and give this a look over. Now you'll see here A, B, and C. So that is going to refer to what group the child is in. So I would make a star or a mark that A is for the aggressive group, B is for the non-aggressive group, and C is for the control group. So I would mark A, B, and C in that way if you could, please. I would also highlight in number 3 that we have the experimenter, model, and child in the second room. So the experimenter, of course, is behind the one-way mirror watching everything happen. The model is going to be the older adult who's going to act out, and the child is going to be the person watching all this happen. Now these conditions are timed, and they last for exactly 10 minutes. So we should know that 10-minute kind of quantitative amount. Then if you look at A, B, and C, that is going to tell you what's going to happen in that room based on which group the child is in. Remember, this is one child, one model, and then the experimenter is watching behind the glass. So for A, if the child's in the aggressive group, for 1 minute, the adult model is going to play with, they're like, Tinker Toys are kind of like similar to Legos for 1 minute, and then become aggressive with the Bobo doll verbally and physically for the rest of the time, so for 9 minutes. Now, physical and verbal aggression could be punching the doll, yelling at the doll, calling the doll like mean names. It could be sitting on the doll, slapping the doll, any kind of physical or verbal abuse. Any of that is acceptable for the aggressive model. So that's what they'd be doing. If we move to 4B, this is the non-aggressive group, so the model is not even going to acknowledge the Bobo doll. They're just going to play with the Tinker Toys for the entire 10 minutes, not even give the Bobo doll any kind of attention. And then in 4C, since it's a control group, I would mark for 4C that there is no model present. So the only person in that room is the child and the experimenter. The child is by themselves, and the experimenter is behind the glass. So the child can sit in the room and play with whatever they'd like. They have a bunch of different toy options, and if they want to play with the Bobo doll, or they want to play with the Tinker Toys, or anything else, they can play with whatever they want, and then after 10 minutes have elapsed, they will leave that room. Okay, so here's where things get really interesting. Please mark or highlight or make like a big demarcation in some way that this is where we move into like phase 2 or part 2 of the experiment. So the children were divided into groups based on aggression. They were provoked and annoyed. They observed the adult model, and now they're going to be left alone with the experimenter just watching them behind the glass. No model present for any group. What is the child going to do? So once the child is alone in a room with the Bobo doll, and some other toy options, how are they going to behave? Are they going to imitate what they saw the model do? Or are they going to act the way they want to act, or act in a different way than the model did? So if you want to just take a moment as well, I'd like for you to highlight the remember point. So the aggressive role model group saw the model assault Bobo. Remember, it's both physically and verbally. The non-aggressive role model group sees the model just calmly play with those tinker toys, which are like Legos. And then the control group didn't see a model at all. They got to just play with whatever they wanted to in the room. If you're more of a visual learner, I've just given you a part here that is more visual that you might like better. It's just a graphic kind of showing what Bandura's hypothesis and idea is and how it would work out in this part 2. So you see the up arrow for aggressive model group. We would expect to see an increase in aggression in these children from baseline from the control group. So if they see aggression, they're going to imitate it later on their own. In the control group, they're our baseline measure, so they didn't see a model of any kind. We wouldn't expect any change. And then, of course, with the non-aggressive model group, we would see a decrease in aggression from baseline, that they would be incredibly non-aggressive and calm. You would see a decrease in aggression or just no aggression. So either of those are fine. Except for if you consider that last point saying children in this group showed a marked decrease in aggression even when compared to the control baseline group. So I would highlight that last point. I'm sorry for misspeaking. So just kind of discount that last bit and highlight the part where it says children in this group showed a marked decrease in aggression even when compared to baseline. So for example, if children were in the control group and they were playing with whatever toy they wanted, they could have chosen an aggressive toy like a toy gun or a toy mallet. The children who see an adult be non-aggressive don't choose any of these angry or aggressive toy options. So that's why they have a decrease in aggression even compared to the baseline group. Once again, sorry for misspeaking there. Okay, so continuing with part 2 of the procedure. So the 10 minutes has gone up now for step 5. The model is going to leave the room. The experimenter that was watching that child is now going to come into the room. Okay, come into the room and have a little desk set up. They are going to pretend to quietly work at their desk. So that is just to make sure we have an adult actually physically in the room to make sure the child doesn't try to leave or run out of the room or not participate. Once again, very ethically gray area. And we have another experimenter or observer who's behind that one-way mirror to do the job the experimenter was once doing. So they've kind of swapped out. Now the experimenter is going to be in the room at a little desk just to make sure the child plays along, not trying to influence the child's choice of play in any way, just to make sure the child is safe. So that kind of moves on to step 6. Model leaves room. 20-minute observation of the child begins, so twice as long as the last period. We're going to have one researcher watching the child from behind the one-way mirror, and the one experimenter who's just going to be sitting there at the little desk. The person who is watching the child through the one-way mirror is going to record their behavior every 5 seconds. So that would mean there's 240 possible response units per child. You should circle or highlight where it says note. This second part of the test, where we watch what the child does based on what they saw, is called a test of delayed imitation. This is because we want to see if the child imitates what their model did. If the model's aggressive, is the child aggressive? If the model was calm and non-aggressive, is the child calm and non-aggressive? So we're going to call that a test of delayed imitation. All right, so part 2 is about to wrap up. It's complete. 20 minutes go by. The child's free to go. Return to their parents. Then step 8 is done just as a way to improve validity. A second scorer comes in and rates the behaviors of half the children. And this was a high rate of concordance. They saw the same things. So we have a very high level of validity here and a score of 0.9, which is very, very close to 1.0, which would be a perfect match. So we had the children's responses on tape, and this second rater comes in, watches the tapes, rates the behaviors of the children using the same measure, and they come to the same conclusion. So we have a very good level of validity and a very good measurement tool here. Moving on now to some important information. As we said, the child's being observed through the one-way mirror. When the observer is watching everything, they're going to sort the child's behavior into one of 4 categories. Response measures or imitative aggression, partially imitative aggression, further categories, and non-aggressive play or not playing. So you should know these 4 categories and what kind of behaviors would fall into each. I would please make a note on this slide that that's going to come straight out of your textbook. So make sure here you reference your Julia Russell text and you know what these categories are and at least one example of an activity done by the child that would fall into each of these 4 categories. Now, just to give you an idea of some of the toy options the children had when they were playing, when they were in that room and they were having the opportunity to do whatever they wanted when they're in the part 2 of the experiment, when they're not watching the aggressive model, when they moved on, or the aggressive or non-aggressive model, when they've moved on to part 2, these are the toy options they might have had. So things like stickers, tinker toys, mallets, of course the Bobo doll is present, a dart gun, a tetherball, a tea set, some crayons, plastic animals, balls, dolls, stuffed bears, and cars and trucks. So you'll see that we have a lot of gendered choices, a lot of female and male choices for these children to engage in. So they had options with other things they may have wanted to play with. They didn't have to become aggressive with the doll out of boredom, let's say. They had a lot of other options they could have chosen. At this point, I'd like to kind of ethically address why we had to upset the children, or Bandura had to deliberately annoy them at the beginning of the experiment. As I said, learning usually doesn't happen this fast. So we had to heighten the children's emotional state to get them a little upset, to see some kind of reaction. And then if you look at our second reason, differences in aggression levels between all 3 groups could be measured in a standardized way. So to put that in basic terminology, you can't say, for example, that Johnny came into the experiment upset because he spilled his milk in the morning, or Jenny was very, very angry this morning because she lost her favorite doll. So all of the children are equally upset to begin with. I know that seems like a crazy reason, but we had to make sure you didn't have some kids who were like angry in the morning, some who were happy, some who were sad. All the kids are kind of equally upset because the same thing has been done to them at the beginning of the experiment. And I thought this picture on the side of the girl making the scowl was just too cute, so I had to include it. All right, moving on to data and results. We are currently on slide 29. So, imitative physical aggression for boys, 25.8. Imitative physical aggression for girls, 7.2. This makes sense. Boys are shown to be much more physically aggressive than girls. So that is reinforced by what we talked about earlier, gender norms, expectations, socialization. So this is very consistent with what we thought we'd find. The non-aggressive group showed the least aggression, of course. This makes sense as well. Less than those in the aggressive and the control groups. Interestingly, all the boys and girls who saw the non-aggressive model were also non-aggressive. They played with things that were very calm and relaxing, like dolls. And some of them didn't even play at all. They just sat quietly in the room and kind of relaxed by themselves. So they didn't take up a toy or pick up some crayons or anything like that. They just sat quietly in the room, relaxed, and did not play with any actual stimuli. So these children were incredibly, incredibly calm and relaxed after seeing a model be non-aggressive. Interestingly, as a piece of qualitative data, the experimenters recorded the remarks made by the children about the models, about models who were being aggressive. So these remarks reflect the time, the era, the socialization of the 1950s and 60s, the idea that males are supposed to be aggressive, that that's an appropriate thing to do, whereas females should never be aggressive or physical in that way. It really does reflect the culture. and the disapproval of the children when someone violates those cultural norms or that societal norm. So getting very upset when a female gets aggressive because that's not expected or not how the woman or the female is supposed to behave. It doesn't matter if it's verbal or physical. The idea that women could be aggressive in any way is very unsettling for a lot of the children. So you'll see in their comments, they reinforce or they like men being aggressive, but they're very uncomfortable with women being aggressive in any way. Take a moment and look over some of these comments. The first group are comments based on what the male did, and the second group are comments based on what the female did. You'll notice it's both aggressive models, so it's what the aggressive male does and what the aggressive female does. And look at the difference about how they're perceived by the children. We've already gone over all 4 of Bandura's hypotheses, and all 4 of them were confirmed. So all you need to do on this slide is highlight or circle the part that says were confirmed. We don't need to re-go over these, so just take a moment, highlight or circle the were confirmed part, and then we're going to move on. Once again, we've gone over this already, so you can feel free to skip forward. Let's move on to strengths and weaknesses. We'll have these in every single study, so please take note of them. Strengths are that it's a lab experiment. They did a great job controlling all the extraneous variables. The children were all equally upset at the beginning of the experiment, and the experiment is highly valid because the children began in the same mood state. The experiment is also highly reliable because every single child experiences the same exposure, meaning even though some of them see aggressive, some of them see non-aggressive, and some of them don't even see a model, everything else is incredibly standardized. So the room they're in, the toy options they have, the fact of how long they're in there, so 10 minutes, 20 minutes, all of that is exactly the same. Very highly reliable experiment. We also have that great strength of inter-observer reliability. Both raters have extremely similar scores. They see the same behaviors. They have a high rate of correlation of 0.9. They see things the same way, and they record it numerically the same way. So that's fantastic. And that extra pretest of the children's baseline aggression, what we call matching them for aggression before the experiment actually started. It makes sure that even if children have different personalities, some are more aggressive than others, because they're numerically scored, they can be mixed evenly throughout the groups, so we don't have a super aggressive group or a super mellow group. Some more strengths. The way the behavior is recorded in a standardized manner is fantastic. So we have these 4 pre-made categories. We talked about you guys reading in your book and recording. Behaviors being recorded at specific time intervals of 5 seconds. So every 5 seconds, the observers are seeing what the children are doing. So all conditions are timed. That's 10 minutes or 20 minutes, I believe. And then the method of observation, using that one-way mirror, you have a clear view of the children the entire time. They can't, for example, like hide in a corner. You can see everything the entire time if you're the experimenter or the observer. It removes the risk of demand characteristics. This is very crucial, so if you guys could please highlight this one or star or mark this, that'd be excellent. Children are going to act, and people are going to act normally when they don't know they're being watched. So if you're being watched and you don't know that, you're going to behave the way you normally do. You're going to go about your business and just do your thing. If you know you're being watched, as we've talked about, people tend to tense up, get nervous, uncomfortable, and get very stiff and not give natural, organic, meaningful responses. So in this case, they really remove the risk of demand characteristics, which is a major strength. Moving on to weaknesses now. There's really only 2, because we're going to go into ethics separately because there's so much to cover ethically. So small sample, meaning that technically we had a major overall sample size of, I want to say it was 72, but we broke the children down over and over until there were 6 children per group, which is far too few to generalize our data. The idea that we have only 6 boys who see an aggressive female and 6 girls who see an aggressive female, 6 girls to see an aggressive male, 6 boys to see an aggressive male. These individual groups are way too small. So that's an issue. Also, I'm sorry if you hear like a weird scratching, latching noise. My cat, I closed the door to do the audio lecture and my cat's trying to scratch his way in. So I'm sorry if you guys hear that. It'll be over in a second. But having a biased sample, these children all attended this Stanford nursery school. So that implies that their parents are all highly intelligent, possibly of the same socioeconomic status, meaning that they're quite wealthy, and usually the vast majority of them at this time period were white. So same geographic area, same level of maybe base IQ and intelligence, same level of socioeconomic status or the amount of wealth in that community, and white means we've got a really limited sample, unfortunately. All right, now moving on to the ethical issues. Causing distress to children is a bad thing. We know this. Children are annoyed. They have the attractive toys taken away from them. At least in this case, the stress was relatively mild and it passed quickly. At the time, this was acceptable and Bandura was allowed to move forward with the study. But we've got another big problem here, and that's consent. It's not mentioned in the PDF file, in your text, anywhere I've looked, whether or not consent was given by the parents or the guardians to do this, or even the children themselves. So I don't know, if we could ever do this in the present. It's not very ethical if, of course, they bypassed the children and just asked the parents, or if they didn't even ask the parents at all and just moved forward and said, oh, here's your child. They had an interesting day at Stanford nursery school. So, of course, that would be very, very unethical. We would have to improve that if we were going to do a modern version of it today. And moving on to our big 5. The first one is going to be application to everyday life. So today, children are exposed to aggression through a huge variety of mediums, whether that's TV, news reports, movies, video games, even things like Grand Theft Auto. They see aggression in a lot more of an open way than they ever had before. And based on Bandura, we see that young children observing this kind of behavior is going to affect them, especially boys. So I would highlight in that middle bullet point, particularly boys. So this is actually where TV ratings came from in a major way. If you remember growing up and seeing like TV 14 or PG 13, TVMA, all of those ratings actually kind of came from the idea of Bandura, warning children, warning parents what kind of content is going to be in this program or this show or movie so they can decide if that's okay for their children. So now that this TV labeling has become part of what we know, some countries do it differently. So it's become part of the vast majority of countries and cultures, but every country has a little bit of a variation as to how they do it. So this labeling, they call it different things in different places. So in the UK, they have this thing called Watershed. At 9 o'clock, they air their more adult material. So there's kind of a limit. They wouldn't want young kids, for example, to see a show with some kind of explicit death scene where someone was murdered or shot or something. So all of their adult content comes on after 9 o'clock in the evening so that you couldn't be sitting home with your child, in the morning with cartoons or midday or something when they're home and they'd see something inappropriate. So Bandura has actually influenced everyday life in the sense of how we think about aggression, television viewing, and when things are actually shown. Of course, nature versus nurture is going to have a big interplay in this study. Both of them are equally valid, and both of them are going to be cornerstones in Bandura. So, of course, if we look at the nature element, biologically, boys have more testosterone. So they're built with more testosterone in their bodies, which is a natural biochemical. It's a hormone, and it can be linked to aggression. So that's going to be our nature side. Boys are XY, they have more testosterone, and this is going to affect their behavior. Now, on the nurture side, we would have the actions of the model, their environment, what they see, and of course, the social norms and the gender stereotypes and expectations. The idea that boys are rewarded for that sex-type behavior reinforced by society, what is masculine, what is appropriate. Now, looking at this through the lens of individual and situational explanations, both are going to have a part in Bandura. On the individual level, a person can watch something, but personality is going to come into play here, how the child reacts to the model. If they are naturally more aggressive, are naturally more relaxed and non-aggressive, that is going to affect what they choose to do. Also, boys and girls are treated differently as individuals based on sex. So girls are praised for not fighting and not being aggressive. Boys are praised for being masculine and aggressive. So it's going to reinforce the stereotype and affect their behavior as well. How they've been socialized will affect the choice they make. However, on the situational side, how the model acts is obviously going to affect the children. And we see that because the aggressive model really affects boys more. It really is more evident in boys how major the change is and how much seeing a same-sex model be aggressive really impacts boys. So that's something situational we really have to think about. Now, we remember that we use children in this study and their age is from 3 to 6. So ethically, we have to discuss what was done, and of course, when it comes to practicality, practically what you can and cannot do with children. We don't know if they gave consent or have the opportunity to withdraw. Children are what we call a vulnerable group. They need to be protected, as we talked about in the beginning of the year. So any distress caused to them has to be super minimal. We don't know if parents gave consent. The only person acknowledged in the actual literature is the teacher, ironically. So we don't know where the parents play in, where they kind of fall when it comes to consent given or not. Of course, parents or guardians should give consent if a child is going to be taking part in a study. Now, boys and girls are also treated different as individuals based on sex. We talked about that on the last slide. So I've kind of put that in here as well, that ethically it's not right to reinforce aggression in boys. Ethically, we should not reinforce aggression as being a good thing or reinforcing these stereotypes. So ethically, we need to think about how what we do as a society is impacting our children. It's also not fair to only embrace women being feminine or girls being feminine and delicate. We should also embrace the idea that girls are not just that stereotype also. Now, if we look at this from a practical point of view, children are the ideal candidates for the study because they have been exposed to far less violence than adults in their lifetime. They haven't been exposed to violent TV shows yet, you would hope, or violence in domestic violence or seeing violence in their lives. So that would mean they have less extraneous variables that affect them on a daily basis. They are also more trusting and naive. That's why the one-way mirror would work on children and not on adults. So moving on to some further research, if we wanted to improve this or make some changes, we had here both quantitative and qualitative data recorded. So that's really good. But as usual, we could always make things better. So we could have used some version of a self-report with the children, maybe to gauge how they were feeling when they were watching this model act a certain way. This would shed a lot of light on the sex differences between boys and girls. They saw the same thing, but how did they feel about it during? And we don't know how long these aggressive effects last. So this reminds me in a way almost like what we did with Lainey with the asparagus and the false memory. We don't know how long that false memory effect lasted. In this case, we don't know how long the feeling or thought or idea to imitate aggression, how long did that last? So there needs to be a follow-up, possibly, maybe a month, maybe 2 months, like every standardized interval. We could determine how long the children acquired these behaviors or if they're even permanent. All right, everyone, thank you so much for your time and paying attention to this presentation today. I hope you're having a wonderful afternoon or evening or morning or whatever time it is when you're listening to this. You've officially finished the presentation. So this is the first time that you have no homework, no PowerPoint questions. You have multiple choice questions on this test. So if you look here, these topics are what is going to be on your multiple choice quiz. Okay? It's going to be very specific, because I've written these myself, about what's going to be on the quiz and how much depth you need to know for every single thing. So if you move on here, you'll see I'll say, for example, understand and give examples of, verbatim, so have it as written, have this in a shortened form, basics of something is just the basic ideas, examples, and then how many I'd like of certain things. So 4 conclusions, 2 strengths, 2 weaknesses, 2 explanations. Once again, basics versus detailed. So basics is just, general ideas. And then, of course, detailed is going to be more in-depth. And that's it, everyone. Thank you so much. Let me know if you have any questions. Once again, this is Ms. Mokwa, Wellington Community High School AICE Psychology Program. This is the AS level presentation for Bandura, which is part of the Learning Unit Study 1. So thank you guys so much, and have a good day. Bye.